All right, diving in today. And this one's pretty fundamental, especially if you're into, well, philosophy, obviously, but like the real nitty-gritty, the foundations of logic. We're talking medieval theories of consequence.
Yeah, we're going way back to when these thinkers, these philosophers, they were wrestling with, like, what does it even mean for one idea to really truly follow from another?
Exactly. And for anyone listening who, really digs into philosophy, I think this deep dive into the roots of logic, going way back, it's going to be pretty interesting.
It really should be. And the text we're using to guide us, it's a good one, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It gives us a really comprehensive scholarly view.
Perfect. So mission for this deep dive.
Okay, so we're going to try to distill the core ideas from these medieval theories of consequence, trace how they developed over time, hit the major points of debate, and, always kind of keeping in mind, what's a philosopher really going to want to know? Like, what's going to make them think?
Exactly. And the big question, the one that these medieval folks were obsessed with, it sounds simple at first, but it's really deep. When does one sentence, one idea really follow from another? It's like the heart of how we reason, but they really broke it down piece by piece.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
Think about a simple example, like every human is an animal, therefore some animal is a human. Seems obvious, right? But they wanted to figure out what makes that connection valid. What are the underlying principles, and do those principles always hold up?
And what's really wild is how these super old ideas, they actually laid the groundwork for so much of modern logic.
Yeah, it's amazing. Things they were debating centuries ago, philosophers are still arguing about them, refining them today. It really shows you how sharp these folks were.
So let's get into it. For someone who's, really familiar with modern logic, how do we even start to wrap our heads around this medieval view of consequence? Where do we begin?
Well, I think a good starting point, given that background, is Tarski. His criteria for logical consequence are, a pretty big deal. He talked about necessary truth preservation. Basically, the idea that if your premises are true, there's no way your conclusion can be false.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's the substitution of terms, sometimes called the formality criterion. It means, like, the argument's got to hold up no matter what specific terms you swap in, as long as you keep the logical structure the same.
So that gives us a modern framework. How did the medieval folks approach these same ideas, these core parts of consequence?
The historical context is really important here. I mean, if we want to really understand our current debates about logical consequence, it helps to see how the whole concept evolved. And these medieval thinkers, they were like right at the beginning.
So what were they focused on?
Well, there are three big themes that kept popping up in their discussions. First, just like Tarski, they were really into this idea of necessary truth preservation. Second, they started developing this notion of substitution of terms, this idea of formality, though they didn't always understand it exactly the same way as we do now. And third, they had this fascinating idea of containment.
Containment.
Yeah, the idea that the conclusion is like somehow already present, inherent within the premises.
I can see how that one could have a bunch of different interpretations. What did they actually mean by containment, philosophically speaking?
You're right. It was a really multifaceted idea. For some, it was a metaphysical thing or maybe semantic. Like the very meaning of the premises just inherently includes the meaning of the conclusion.
Yeah.
But later on, especially with the British thinkers, it took on a more epistemic flavor. They thought understanding the premises would automatically lead you to understand the conclusion.
Okay. So, big picture. When these medieval thinkers were developing their theories of consequence, logically speaking, what were they really looking at? What was the core of their inquiry?
They were really focused on relationships. Logical relationships between sentences, propositions, that sort of thing. They were trying to figure out what makes inferences valid, those steps we take from one idea to the next. And they were also digging into the semantics of conditionals, those if-then statements that are so crucial in logic.
Right.
Now, they didn't always make all the distinctions we do today, but it was all centered on how sentences and propositions connect.
And all this new thinking, how did it relate to the system they already had, the Aristotelian syllogistic? Did they see themselves as, replacing it, building on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. That relationship, it definitely changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
At first, some saw syllogistic and consequence as two separate things. Aristotle's topics often provided a framework for analyzing arguments that didn't quite fit the syllogistic mold. And there was also the idea that, maybe all valid reasoning could actually be boiled down to syllogistic form.
Mm-hmm.
But by the 14th century, the main view was that consequence was bigger, more general, It included syllogistic as like a specific type of inference. Think of it as like consequence is the whole field, and syllogistic is one important part of it.
Okay.
And it's interesting, even with this broader focus, the 14th century saw some real big advancements within syllogistic itself. And a lot of these developments, they were happening right inside these treatises on consequence.
So beyond the syllogism, now, were these medieval thinkers, were they more into the philosophical, like the abstract ideas behind consequence? Or were they getting into the technical stuff, making rules of inference, that kind of thing?
It was both, really. And that's one of the things that makes them so interesting for philosophers of logic today. You've got people like Abelard, Burley, Buridan. They were all coming up with rules of inference, even exploring logical theorems.
Wow.
Yeah. They were analyzing those logical operators like if or not, and looking into metalogical principles too, like transitivity of consequence, what impossible statements mean, all that. For our deep dive, though, we're going to stay focused on the philosophy, how they understood and defined consequence, rather than getting bogged down in the technical details. But it's important to remember, these texts, they were really sophisticated, even though they didn't have all the fancy symbols we use today.
Okay, that gives us a good overview. Now, let's rewind. Way back to the very beginnings of these ideas. Who were the key players and what were those early ideas about consequence before it became, its own dedicated area of study?
Well, you can't talk about logic without talking about Aristotle. He's the foundation. His prior analytics, his whole development of syllogistic logic, that was the main way people understood correct reasoning for centuries. And his definition of a valid deduction, it's basically an early version of necessary truth preservation. He said a valid deduction is one where the conclusion follows of necessity from the premises.
But, as we said before, necessary truth preservation, that wasn't the only thing that made an argument valid for Aristotle. Right?
You got it. It was necessary, but it wasn't enough. Syllogistic validity, it also depended on the structure of the argument, the arrangement of the terms, the quantity and quality of the premises, all that. Like, take the principle of reflexivity. A implies A. It obviously preserves truth, but Aristotle's system didn't consider it a valid syllogism.
Interesting.
And here's something else. Aristotle, he also suggested that the premises act as material causes of the conclusion, which hints at this idea of containment, a real connection between the antecedent and the consequent. These are ideas that pop up later in relevance logics. And while he did use letters, like schematic letters, there's debate about whether he saw substitution of terms as like a fundamental part of validity or just a tool, a way to make things easier to understand.
I see. What about his other works, like the Topics? What did they add to all this?
The Topics. It's really important for understanding this bigger idea of what follows from what. It's all about dialectical arguments, how to argue effectively in debates. So naturally, it has to deal with consequence. But in a broader way, outside of the strict rules of syllogistic, it gave people a way to analyze all sorts of inferences, not just the syllogistic ones.
So Aristotle set the stage in a bunch of ways. Who were the next big thinkers to pick up these ideas?
Well, the ancient commentators on Aristotle, they were really crucial. Aristotle himself, he didn't explicitly talk about applying form and matter to logic, but the commentators did. They made this distinction between the logical form, the structure, and the content, the matter, of syllogisms. And they argued that validity, it's all about the form. Alexander of Aphrodisias, he was key here.
Right.
He noticed that syllogistic patterns work because they keep the same structure no matter what you plug into them. He connected this to Aristotle's use of letters, saying validity depends on the figure, the way premises are combined, their mood, not just the specific topic they're about.
So they were starting to see validity as this abstract thing, separate from the specific content. How did these Greek ideas make their way into the medieval world?
Boethius. He's the bridge. Before the big Aristotle revival in the 12th century, he was the guy who brought Greek logic to the Latin West. And he basically created the logical vocabulary they used throughout the Middle Ages. His works, especially on hypothetical syllogisms and on topical differentials, they were like the textbooks.
What did he add to the theory of consequence, specifically what was important for those later medieval thinkers?
On hypothetical syllogisms, he used the term consequentia. He focused on conditionals. And he made this distinction between natural consequences and accidental consequences. Both had to do with inseparability, kind of like necessary truth preservation. But natural consequences also needed a real connection between antecedent and consequent, like a causal connection or something metaphysical. In ontopical differentials, he talked about maximal propositions. These are like general principles you can use to make inferences. So he was taking topical arguments, which are usually about probability, and giving them a kind of necessity.
Interesting.
And when it came to containment, he understood it mostly in a metaphysical way, like relating to genus and species, rather than a direct connection between the antecedent and consequent.
Okay, so Boethius gave them the vocabulary and some important distinctions. What happened between Boethius and those later, more developed theories of consequence in the Middle Ages?
Yeah, that period, we don't have as many manuscripts, so it's a little harder to say for sure. But it seems like the early approaches to logic after Boethius were a bit more Platonist, maybe more metaphysical. Later on, you see more focus on language and some exploration of inferences. But it's not until Peter Abelard in the 12th century that you get a really original, really sophisticated theory of, well, what we call consequence, though he used the term inferentia more broadly.
Abelard. He was a fascinating guy, always ahead of his time. What was his take on inferentia, and how did it relate to consequentia?
His theory, it's mostly laid out in his Dialectica, and it's really impressive for its time. He saw consequentia as a specific type of inferentia. He really stressed this idea of necessity of consecution, which seems to be more than just truth preservation. It suggests a tighter connection, a more relevant connection between the antecedent and consequent.
Right.
And he explored different kinds of containment, not just metaphysical, but semantic and even epistemic.
But the big thing with Abelard was his distinction between perfect and imperfect inferences, right? What was that all about?
Yeah, that was huge. He said perfect inferences are the ones where, just by looking at the structure of the antecedent, you can immediately see that the consequent has to be true. The consequent structure is like already contained in the antecedent. And he argued that these inferences, they're not valid because of how things are in the world, but because of the complexity of the logical structure itself.
Fact.
Which means if you swap out the terms but keep the structure the same, the consecution still holds up. That's basically an early version of the substitution of terms criterion. Imperfect inferences, on the other hand, they didn't pass the substitution test, but they still met the necessity of consecution. So for Abelard, formality, this idea of substitutivity, it defined a special class of inferences, but it wasn't the only way an inference could be valid.
That focus on structure, on substitutivity, it sounds so modern. Why didn't his ideas take off right away?
Good question. His ideas were deep, and they definitely influenced later thinkers, but they weren't immediately embraced. We only have one complete manuscript of his Dialectica, so it might not have been widely circulated. The more traditional Boethian view, where topical principles were seen as the foundation for valid inferences, that probably had more sway in the 12th century.
So what happened after Abelard? What were the big developments in the 13th century that led up to that boom in theories of consequence in the 14th century?
The 13th century, it was a time of big change in logic. You had the Determinist tradition coming up, focused on properties of terms, and a bunch of Aristotle's texts were rediscovered and brought into the mix. So now you've got Logica Vetus, the old logic based on Boethius, Logica Nova, incorporating the new Aristotle, and Logica Modernorum, where consequence starts being discussed more explicitly.
Wow, a lot going on.
Right. A lot of 13th century thinkers, they still had a pretty metaphysical view.
Right.
They really emphasized real connections, often causal connections, between the antecedent and consequent, often working within the framework of topics and containment. But a really important development was this idea of applying hylomorphism to arguments, especially syllogisms. Hylomorphism is that form-matter distinction from Aristotle.
Right.
And applying that to logic, separating the abstract structure, the form, from the specific content, the matter, that laid the groundwork for a more explicit idea of formal consequence in the 14th century.
Did anyone actually use the term formal consequence in the 13th century?
They did. Simon of Faversham, late 13th century, he used formal consequence, consequentia ratione formae, as opposed to consequence in virtue of matter, and he specifically connected formal validity to the idea that it holds in all matter, which basically means substitution of terms. Other thinkers like John Duns Scotus used the term too, but it didn't always mean exactly the same thing, this substitution-based understanding. But by the 14th century, they had the conceptual tools they needed to really dig into the nature of consequence.
Okay. So now we're in the 14th century, the golden age of theories of consequence. What happened to make everyone suddenly so interested in this topic?
Well, the exact reasons are still being debated, which is interesting in itself, from an intellectual history perspective.
Right.
One idea was that it all came out of those commentaries on Aristotle's Topics, because the Topics is about non-syllogistic reasoning. And it's true. Early discussions of consequence, like Abelard's, they often happened in a topical context.
But didn't scholars find some problems with that idea?
Yeah, and more recent scholarship, looking at late 13th century topics commentaries, they haven't found a clear, direct connection to those core ideas in 14th century consequence theory. The topics and the approaches are pretty different. So the topics were definitely important for the history of logic, but they probably weren't the direct source for these specialized treatises on consequence.
So if not the topics, what caused this explosion of interest in consequentiae?
The current thinking is that it was a combination of things. Different areas of logic kind of came together. You had treatises on syncategoremata. Those are the logical words like if, and, not, the words that structure sentences. And they were looking at how these words behave in conditional statements.
Right.
You had discussions of hypothetical syllogisms, commentaries on Aristotle's prior analytics, which is about formal validity, but in a different way than the topics. And yeah, some ideas from the topical tradition probably played a role too. Some scholars argue that the way they analyzed the logical properties of syncategoremata in the late 13th century, it's really similar to early 14th century work on consequence.
So it was like all these different streams of thought coming together. And even in the 14th century, there were different schools of thought on how to define consequence, right?
Absolutely. We can group them into four main categories. First, you have those early collections of rules about consequences, almost like handbooks for how to argue logically. Then you have treatises that really focused on those middles we were talking about, the intrinsic and extrinsic middles. That came from the topical tradition. These folks were really interested in what makes consequence tick. Walter Burley's De Puritate and William of Occam's Summa Logicae are good examples of this.
Okay.
Third, you have the Parisian or continental tradition. Jane Buridan was the big name here. They defined formal consequence, mainly based on the substitutivity criterion. And fourth, you have the British school. They defined formal consequence based on whether the conclusion was contained or understood in the premises. And they often had a pretty strong epistemic cognitive way of thinking about it.
So even when everyone was focused on consequence, there was still disagreement about what formal consequence actually meant?
Oh, absolutely. But one thing they all agreed on, necessary truth preservation. Every school of thought, they all agreed that that was fundamental for any valid consequence. And it's important to remember, these theoretical discussions, they weren't happening in a vacuum. They were tied to this practice of obligations. A really formal type of debate where they used and argued about the rules of consequence.
Okay, let's talk about some specific thinkers. What did Burley and Occam contribute?
Burley, his early De Consequentiis, it was one of the first treatises specifically about consequence. He introduced this distinction between simple consequence, which is always true, and ut nunc consequence, which is only true at a particular time. And he actually included syllogisms in his discussion of consequence. His later views, in the longer De Puritate, are often seen as a response to Occam. Occam, in his Summa Logicae, he had a really complex theory of consequence with 9 different distinctions. And the formal material distinction, it comes up pretty late in his analysis.
Okay. He defined formal consequence using those middles we talked about before.
Exactly. Yeah. Intrinsic and extrinsic middles.
Can you remind us what those middles were for anyone listening who's forgotten?
Sure. An intrinsic middle, it's like another sentence you can make from the terms in the consequence. It's like a hidden premise that connects the given premise to the conclusion. An extrinsic middle, it's more general. It's a rule or a principle about the form of sentences and is what makes the inference valid. Kind of like those maximal propositions Boethius talked about. For Occam, a consequence like Socrates is not running, therefore a man is not running, that would be formal because of the intrinsic middle, Socrates is a man.
I see.
But you can see, if we swap man for dog, it doesn't work anymore. So Occam's idea of formal is a little different from how we think about it today. He also gave the example, only a man is a donkey, therefore every donkey is a man, as a formal consequence. That one's based on an extrinsic middle, a rule about logical equivalence between different types of statements. So for Occam, formality was all about these middle links, these general rules, not just the structure of the sentence.
So his formal isn't quite the same as ours? What about his material consequence?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
He said material consequences are valid just because of what the terms mean. And his examples usually involve consequences with impossible antecedents or a necessary consequence. So he probably saw this category as including things like ex impossibili, quodlibet, from an impossibility anything follows, and ad necessarium, a necessary proposition follows from anything.
Oh.
But the exact nature and scope of material consequence in Occam's view, still debated.
And what about Burley? How did he react to Occam's ideas?
Burley, in his De Puritate de Arte Logicae, he offered a pretty detailed response. He brought back this distinction between natural and accidental consequence, and he framed it using intrinsic and extrinsic topics, which are pretty similar to Occam's middles. He emphasized that in a natural consequence, the antecedent in some way contains the consequent. Interestingly, he seemed to criticize Occam's definition of material consequence. He suggested that formal consequence could also be valid by reason of the terms, but in a way that's still formally valid. But ultimately, neither Occam's nor Burley's versions of the formal material distinction really caught on.
So they were important, but their specific terminology didn't stick. Let's move on to Buridan and the Parisian tradition. They seem to have had a bigger impact, especially with their focus on substitution.
Yeah, definitely. Jean Buridan's Tractatus de Consequentius. It's seen as the most sophisticated work on consequence in the whole medieval period. He started with a general definition of consequence based on necessary truth preservation, but he also saw that it was important to distinguish between consequences that stay valid when you substitute terms and those that don't.
Right.
He used that form-matter distinction and defined formal consequence as one that stays valid even when you substitute the categorematic terms, which are like the matter, but keep the structure of the syncategorematic terms, which are like the form. That's basically our modern understanding of formality based on substitution. Material consequences, for Buridan, were the ones that preserved truth, but didn't pass this substitution test.
So his formal is a lot closer to what we mean by formal today, but he still thought that truth preservation was the basis of all valid consequence.
Exactly. That's what sets him apart from people like Abelard, who, remember, gave a special status to those perfect inferences because of their structure. For Buridan, formality was a characteristic of some valid consequences, but the ultimate reason they were valid was always truth preservation.
Makes sense.
And he actually defined what he meant by form and matter in a proposition and a consequence. He said the form is the syncategorematic terms, and the matter is the categorematic terms. That distinction is really similar to how we talk about logical form and logical constants today.
His Tractatus was a big work. It covered more than just defining consequence.
Oh, yeah, it was comprehensive. He explored a whole bunch of topics. Like, he made general principles based on his definition of consequence, things like ex impossibili quod libet. He also analyzed the logic of modal sentences, distinguishing between composite and divided senses of modality and what they mean logically. The Parisian tradition after Buridan, they basically followed his framework, though they often added to it, refined it, and so on.
What about the commentary on the prior analytics that's attributed to Pseudo-Scotus? How did that fit into the Parisian tradition?
Well, scholars are still debating exactly who wrote it and when, but it takes an approach to consequence that's very similar to what you find in the first book of Buridan's Tractatus. It's all about defining consequence and looking at potential counterexamples. And interestingly, it seems to stumble upon an early version of Curry's paradox, using a self-referential argument about validity.
Wow.
Pseudo-Scotus also had this interesting take on the simple versus ut nunc distinction. He said it only applies to material consequences, and it depends on the modal status of what he called a missing premise that would make the consequence formally valid.
So these logical investigations, they could lead to some pretty complex, even paradoxical ideas. Now, what about the British school? How did they see consequence, especially compared to the Parisian focus on substitution?
The British school, mostly centered at Oxford, they all agreed on necessary truth preservation as the basic definition of consequence. But they had a different way of defining formal consequence. They stressed this idea that in a formal consequence, the conclusion has to be contained or understood, intelligitor, within the premises. That's that containment idea we talked about.
And their idea of understanding, it had a specific meaning, right? Often something epistemic, cognitive.
Exactly. Thinkers like Richard Lavenham and Ralph Strode, they defined formal consequence in terms of this cognitive relationship. Lavenham said a formal consequence is one where the consequent is a necessary part of understanding the antecedent. And Strode said that if you understand what the antecedent means, you automatically understand what the consequent means. Some scholars think this emphasis on understanding means they saw deduction as a mental process, not just an objective relationship between sentences.
So for the British thinkers, formality wasn't so much about the structure of the sentence, about substitutivity. It was more about this intellectual connection, this understandability.
That's a good way to put it. And because of this different perspective, they classified consequences differently. For example, they considered enthenemes, which are arguments with unstated premises. They considered those formally valid, like Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is an animal. They would say that understanding Socrates as a man automatically includes understanding that he's an animal because we know all men are animals.
Right.
The Parisian tradition, they wouldn't say that's formally valid because if you substitute terms, it might not work anymore. Like Socrates is a statue, therefore Socrates is a mammal. But for the British thinkers, material consequences, they were usually limited to those cases like ex impossibility and ad necessarium, where truth is preserved, but there's no real connection, no understandability.
So you have these two really different ways of thinking about formal consequence in the 14th century. One focused on structure, on substitutivity, the other focused on this cognitive relationship, this understanding.
Exactly. It shows a fundamental difference in how they approached logic. The Parisians, after Buridan, they were more extensional. Validity depends on truth across all interpretations, which is what the substitution idea captures. The British, they were more intentional. Validity is all about the connections between the meanings, the understanding of the propositions. Both drew on the history of logic that came before them, but they ended up with different and influential frameworks for understanding consequence. Wow, what a journey. As we wrap up, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? We've seen how the thinking about logical consequence evolved, from its roots in ancient Greece to the complex debates of the 14th century. And this tension between necessary truth preservation, formality as substantivity, and containment, that's a key theme throughout. The 14th century was a really productive time, with different intellectual traditions like the Parisians and the British offering radically different views on what makes a consequence formally valid and on the nature of logic itself.
And these medieval thinkers, their work wasn't just like a historical curiosity. It had a lasting impact on philosophy and logic.
Absolutely. The questions they were asking about logical necessity, the role of form and content in reasoning, the relationship between language, thought, and reality, those questions were foundational for modern logic. They're still relevant today. And their rigorous analysis of consequence, validity, modality, all that, it shaped the very tools and concepts we use in logic today.
So, for our listeners out there, here's something to think about. Which of these medieval criteria for consequence, truth preservation, substitutivity, containment, or understandability, which one makes the most sense to you, and why? Are they really separate ideas, or is there a deeper connection we haven't figured out yet? Maybe we're still grappling with some of the same questions they were centuries ago.
Great question.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.
Take care.